All right, so can everybody hear me? Let me get myself situated here. Oops. You weren't, that's not what we're at. Yeah, we have volume. We will watch that in a second. All right, so I wanted to do a little recap. Last week, I was making the argument that we're all adopted, that we're all children of God, and the process that by which we became adopted is first having to do with Jesus. That Jesus, we read that passage in Luke's gospel where Jesus is 12 years old and he stays behind in the temple. And 3 days later, his parents find him. His mom says, "What were you thinking?" And Jesus' response, sounds like a teenager, was, "Well, you should have known where I was. You shouldn't have had to look for me. I had to be in my Father's house." And so that's really the first time we hear Jesus speaking in any of the Gospels, the youngest he is when he's speaking. And what is he doing? He's affirming this relationship that he has with God, that God is his Father. And then as he starts his ministry, he carries that forward and calls, when he talks about God, calls God Father, not just for him, but for all of his followers. And so basically the way you come into this family is through this faith in Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ's own relationship with God as Father basically is the invitation that you get to that welcoming group of sisters and brothers. And we see that kind of language in Paul's letters, sisters and brothers in Christ, right? That idea that the church is a family, not based on birthright. It doesn't have anything to do with nature, with our, DNA. It's rather a gift of grace. And that's something that Paul talks about. That's something that the Gospels talk about. And I think it's a great model for the church to think of itself as a family, but a family by adoption. The thing that I want to talk about today is the second half of this, which has to do with adoptive families. So you'll see here, from adopted children of God to adoptive family of God. I'm looking at the characteristics of what makes for a successful adoptive family. And I do this with a little bit of trepidation because I feel like our family is still a work in progress. I'm hoping that either next Wednesday or maybe the last Wednesday of this series, my whole family will come and join y'all for dinner. And you'll see that we'll have some difficulty getting the kids to get to the table and stay seated and all that. So I don't want you to be judging me at that point going, he seemed to have it all together, and now I don't trust anything that he has to say because he obviously doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, good. I'm glad that you're laughing. You laugh now, but believe me, I mean, this is not a good time of night for my kids. They start to become crazed lunatics around dinner time. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Don't put me on a pedestal by any means. So you'll notice it says virtue matters. I want to say a little bit something about virtue. I'm a virtue ethicist. I'm a Christian ethicist, but the particular specialty that I focus on is virtue. And two things that I like to say about virtue to explain what it is. One is that it's not something you're born with, right? But it is something that can become second nature. It's like, learning a sport. Let's say being a good long-distance runner. So I think in our DNA, we have the capacity, if everything goes well in our development, to run. It's just sort of a natural progression. But the ability to run like 10 miles, fairly fast, that's something that you have to work on. And virtue's the same way. It's related to our biological being, but it's sort of an extension of that. And it has to do with our choices. So we use our incredible brains to make choices to actually become something that we have the capacity for, and that gets realized. Different people have different biological strengths and weaknesses. So one of the virtues that I like to talk about is courage, right? Okay, so sometimes I like to think of myself as a courageous person. I think I mentioned last time that I was in Alaska, and I don't know if I mentioned this, but we went to Brooks Camp, which is a place where you can look at bears, huge bears that weigh like 1,000 pounds, fairly close. You can observe them from a platform over the falls, or if you're crazy like my dad and I were, you can go fishing in the river that they also fish in. Which it didn't seem like a good idea to me, but I kind of trust my dad. He's a fairly cautious person. He's an engineer, and he's been there twice before. And he said, yeah, nobody's ever been killed, which I suppose is comforting, but then you could always be the first one. We were in this river, and there are all these sub-adults. They're basically teenagers. They're like 3 years old. Their parents just kicked them out, that winter during the spring. Just said, okay, you're emancipated. That's how they say it. And that sounds so, sometimes I want to say to my kids, you're emancipated. You're free. And these sub-adults really don't know what they're doing. They can't fish very well. And they do crazy things. They chase each other up trees. They're really good climbers. And they're fast. They can outrun the fastest human being, Usain Bolt. So you're not going to be able to outrun them. You're not going to be able to outclimb them. You just basically have to be faster than the other people that you're with in your party, right? But the problem with that was my dad was 75 years old, and I'm 50. I'm faster than my dad, but I could just hear it from my mom, what were you thinking? So my dad and I were together, and these two sub-adults got fairly close to us, and you're supposed to just kind of cautiously, say, hello, I'm here, I'm not running away from you, because then that would be a panic, and that would trigger you to run after me. I'm just kind of backing away. And we were backing away, and this bear was coming towards us. We were backing away some more, and then we start going, oh, bear, don't. And then finally got within about 15 feet, and it turned around and walked away. I was like, Dad, did this happen to you before? He's like, no, this is the first time. I mean, I'm scared too. It's like, good. All right, it's not just me. It's like a scaredy cat. So anyway, courage. Some people are somewhat naturally courageous, but it takes actually practice of being in situations. So my sister Kelly, she's a bear biologist. She studied bear behaviors. She got her master's thesis observing bears at a dump. They were going to close this dump up. They wanted to know what the bears were going to do for food, where they were going to go. So she knows all kinds of things. And she's like, oh, yeah, you shouldn't have even moved, because then they're curious and they're coming out. I'm like, that's easy for you to say, I don't know how a bear thinks. So it's that, courage is situational, but it also, once you're in a number of different situations where there's risk involved, you can start to get some sense of what's a potentially bad situation and what's not. And so it is something you can develop and get and face your fears. I remember when I was in junior high and I had a fear of heights, and we had to climb this rope, right, for wrestling. I used to wrestle. And I just was so scared. I could maybe physically do it, but I was scared of heights, and I just, gradually got more and more comfortable with it. So that's kind of how virtue works. You try to get in those situations where you're going to grow and develop, with a mat underneath of you, or somebody who's an expert in bears, and that'll give you the training you need. You can see love here. The three virtues that I want to talk about are faith, hope, and love. And the classic, description of love that we get is from 1 Corinthians, where Paul is writing to a group of people that really don't know what love is. They make all kinds of mistakes. And Paul says love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. So I really feel like successful families that are able to foster and have done it for a while, families that have adopted a kid, I think you get a special training in love as patience, as not getting your way, but being sensitive to where these kids are, because they've all experienced trauma. And trauma changes you. It makes you fearful. It's hard to have courage when the people that you trusted, your caregivers, let you down. And so it takes a long time to build up that trust. And also there's just a lot of chaos a lot of times in kids' lives that are in part of the foster system. So here's where we're going to get to that YouTube video, and hopefully I can pull it up and not get a commercial. So this is a foster parent.
And I wanted to tell you a quick story about what it's like to be a foster parent. This is our daughter, Linda. She was 3 years old when she came to us, and we since adopted her and her sister. When she first came to us, she had the hardest time going to bed. At night, she would just get filled with anxiety and fear, and that would usually manifest in her just acting crazy. She just would do anything to not be in bed. And if we would ignore her
I really love that. I love that how the honesty of how hard that process is. You know, you want to have this method. I don't know if you guys ever watched that show, Super Nanny. He's talking about this being the Super Nanny method. We used to call it Ferberizing your kid, right, where you walk them back without saying anything, without looking at them directly. That idea is so tempting. I mean, when you're a parent and things aren't going right, there must be some technique that you can use, right, that is going to make this a manageable situation, that give you hope that things are going to be easier. It might be difficult at first, but if you're just consistent and so on. And I love how the conclusion that he comes to, which is basically, you just have to do this for 18 months and then it gets easier. Which is, you're not going to sell a lot of books that way. The 18-month, plan to get your kids to go to bed on time without complaining. I also think that demonstrates the way in which that attachment, is so crucial between the parent and the child, and that just takes time to develop, and it takes consistency and patient love, just exactly what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians. Those are the virtues that you have to have in order to love somebody who's under your care, whatever age they are, whatever that relationship is. You need to have that patience and endurance, and so it's not a quick fix. With Isaiah had no problem going to sleep. In fact, he would sleep through anything. I mean, he could have the fire alarms could be going off. He could have a wet diaper or a poopy diaper. He'd sleep through anything. I mean, when he was awake, he was just 100% nonstop action. And when he was asleep, he was just like completely out of it. But what we did have a problem with was when we took him out on a walk, he wouldn't follow us. He would see something, you'd see a butterfly or something, and he'd just follow the butterfly. And he had no anxiety that we were, a little too far away from him. And then if there was somebody, we'd often go to the college campus where I teach. If there was a girl with blonde hair, about 19, 20 years old, he would go to her like she was his mother, because his mother was 19 and she had blonde hair. And so, in his mind, he had this vague attachment to this type of person. So it just took a lot of time and encouragement and patience. I'm the type of person that when I go on a walk, I want to get there, right? And so he was young enough, he was about 2.5, that you could put him in a stroller, but then he wanted to push the stroller. He wanted to be in charge, and then it became all about doing fun things with the stroller, and we never got anywhere. So it was a back and forth. I want to also talk about these they're called theological virtues. So there are 3 theological virtues: love, faith, and hope. Another reason to look at 1 Corinthians 13, because Paul talks about all 3 of them in that passage. There's a theologian, a New Testament scholar by the name of N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright is probably the closest thing that we have now to a C.S. Lewis in England. He's, I believe, still Bishop of Durham, and he is a very well-known New Testament scholar. And he wrote this book called After We Believe, which is intended for a general audience. Sometimes he writes for specialized audiences, but this is very readable. If you want to get the idea of what it means to be, what the Christian life is about from a virtue ethics perspective, I highly encourage reading this book, because that's what he talks about. He says, okay, we hear a lot about what it means to become a Christian, but we don't really hear a lot about, once you are a Christian, what kind of life you're supposed to lead. And he kind of takes to task the conservative church for being too concerned about works righteousness, and also the liberal church for being maybe a little too concerned only about social issues, but not about personal ethics as well, and tying those in with social issues. So he has this definition of faith and hope. He says, faith is the settled, unwavering trust in the one true God whom we have come to know in Jesus Christ. And notice his definition for hope is very similar, but there's some differences. Hope is the settled, unwavering confidence that this God will not leave us or forsake us, but will always have more in store for us than we could ask or think. So what is the difference between faith and hope? Faith has to do with God directly. And I wouldn't say it's an intellectual, confidence that God exists. I would say it goes deeper than that in saying that God is a loving God. Faith is an understanding that God is a loving God, and we know that because of Jesus Christ. So I think that fits in with his definition. We know God through Jesus Christ as a loving God. Hope, on the other hand, is the confidence that God's love applies to us. You might say, well, if God's a loving God, then why would we doubt that God loves us? But we do, right? I think we all experience difficulties in our lives where we say, if God loved us, this wouldn't be happening to us. So hope is that confidence, even in the face of evidence that seems to be contrary to God loving us, that God actually does love us. And all three of these things kind of have to work together, faith, hope, and love, if we are able to live out the Christian life well. Now, I do want to say that I differ a little bit from N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright's an Anglican, and Anglican theology can be a little bit more optimistic about sanctification and our ability to be transformed by God's grace than the Reformed tradition. The Reformed tradition maybe is a little bit closer to Luther's skepticism about sanctification. And I remember my book, I have this book on Reformed virtue ethics. I was talking to Alan McSween about it when I first came to PC. I think we were at First Presbyterian Church, and he said, you really have to be careful about saying that Christians can be virtuous people. And I think that's true. My argument in the book is that it's an eschatological reality. So we are going to be virtuous in heaven, right? And I take this, there's a theologian, Karl Barth, a Swiss theologian, who talks about this and says that, yes, in heaven we're going to be made holy, but in a certain sense that reality is coming into our existence now. We can experience it when we hear God's call and we respond to it. So I have a little bit different view than N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright makes it sound like, having faith, hope, and love is kind of the same thing as training for a marathon. There's this steady progress that you make. In my experience, and I think the experience of many of us, is that our lives just don't reflect that. That sometimes we're good at loving and sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're hopeful and sometimes we're not. And we can go years and think that we're making progress, and then something happens and it feels like we're right back to square one. So I find Barth's view of this, that God is constantly calling us back into that way of being, that future self, thinking about where we're going to be and giving us opportunities to live into that reality. That's how I think of virtue. It's a little bit different than most people express how virtue is developed. Okay, there's a handout. That is being passed around that gives you a little bit of an introduction to the foster care system in South Carolina. While that handout is being passed around, I want to show this graphic. Okay, so this is a caseworker for foster care. And these are all the different organizations and people that a caseworker will be involved with for just one child. Okay, so say there's a child in the foster care system, and that caseworker has to be in connection with the birth family, trying to work with them to develop a plan so that they can get their child back. They have to be, oftentimes, their first experience with the case is through the legal system. Oftentimes the police are involved, and so you're involved with law enforcement. There are police reports that you have to read to get a sense of what happened with this child, why this child's in foster care. DSS, well, the foster care worker is a part of this organization called the Department of Social Services. That's in South Carolina. That is the state branch that takes care of children in foster care, right? So there are all kinds of bureaucratic structures. You'll see in the overview of foster care, it differs from state to state. So Florida, for example, is much more privatized than South Carolina. I went on their website today, and they talk about customers, right? They say, we're trying to meet the needs of our customers, which is a more of a corporate model, I suppose, if you're thinking about families as customers or children as customers. I personally find it a little scary that this is the relationship. In South Carolina, and the other thing that I thought was interesting in Florida, it's a .com. So it's like Department of Children and Families, and you go to their website, and it's a .com, not a .gov a link, which I thought was kind of interesting. South Carolina, these kids are seen as wards of the state, right? And that also, I think, is somewhat scary and feels unnatural, that the state would basically be trying to be family for these children. You have the guardian ad litem. So this is a court-appointed person who's been properly trained. They go visit each of the children that are involved in these different cases, and then they go to the court, and they make recommendations to the court about what should happen. You have foster parents, you have adoptive parents, you have this foster care review board. After the child's been in foster care for more than 4 months, usually every 6 months or so, this board meets with a caseworker, and they make their own recommendations. You have doctors, because these kids have special needs, right? You have, I don't know what this one is, this TX. I was looking through my notes when I went through foster parent training, and I did some kind of abbreviation, and I don't even know what that stands for. But I left it up there because it's pretty much the experience you get when you're a part of the system, that there's something else that is going on that you can't quite remember what that responsibility is, but it's really important, and it might impinge on the thing. So I left that in there, the school, the court, and so on. Now, in South Carolina, the national standard for a caseworker is between, 12 and 15 cases, I think it says in your handout. But in South Carolina, the hopeful target is between 14 and 20. And as you can see, the majority of caseworkers have more than 20. And it's not unusual for them to have 30 or 40 or in some cases 50 of these cases. And for each one of these cases, they have to deal with all these groups of people. And they're supposed to visit the kid every month. So if you've got, 50 kids, you've got to see like 2 kids every day. And the way this plays itself out, so when we went through training, we went through Greenville County. And so our adoption specialist was from Greenville. And then Isaiah was in Spartanburg County. So then our foster care caseworker was from Spartanburg. And we're in Lawrence County. So all these people, the guardian ad litem, our adoption caseworker, our adoption specialist, our foster care caseworker, they all show up at our door at least once a month. Oftentimes we'd have 2 or 3 of these meetings in a month. And they have to travel like 45 minutes to get to us, right? And then they spend a couple of hours there. So I don't know when they would have time to do any of this paperwork or be in court or do anything else if they're just visiting the kids that are on their caseload. So it's really an impossible thing. And I think you'll see here, there was a case that was made against the state. It was a class action suit last year. It was settled in October. That basically said our foster care system is messed up, and it doesn't come close to meeting national standards. We need to hire a lot more people. It's way underfunded. And then the thing that I think is most disturbing is that there's an over-reliance on these group homes, these institutions. Now, sometimes that's a good thing. I live across the street from Thornwell. That's a group home. And there's just a real family-like atmosphere, where they live in dorms. They have dorm parents and so on. But some of these institutions it's just impossible for them to meet the needs of these kids and be parents to these kids. And so there's a real need for foster families to take some of these kids in. And even in some cases, kids have had to go into juvenile detention centers, even though they don't have criminal records, because there was no place to place them. And the only place they could find for them to go would be in these juvenile detention centers. And then they stay there, right? So it's really a system that needs a lot of overhaul. And yet you meet people in that system, of course, who really love children and want to do something to make the system better. The other thing I want to talk about is this particular case of Zahara. I want to go back. We're going to look at Brad and Angelina for a second. Okay. So totally unrelated, but they adopted a little girl named Zahara. And when you try to look up the case, the state, the case against the state, DSS, there are first names of kids listed, and the one that caught my eye was this girl Zahara who came into foster care when she was 5 years old. You can't find images of these kids. They're minors and they're in foster care. And if you've ever done foster care, you have to be really careful that no photos get out online. You can't post any on Facebook. You have to be really careful. In fact, if you look at some videos on YouTube, you'll see kids who are in foster care, they'll just show them from the neck down because legally they can't do that. So I thought, okay, what image can I give you? Because I think images are important for putting stories. Okay, so this is a girl who has everything, right? And just happens to share the same name as this other girl, Zahara, who had a really difficult situation. And I just put it up there so that you kind of can think of this girl in your mind with some kind of image. So she was 5 years old. She was forcibly removed from her home because of physical abuse, potentially sexual abuse. They placed her in a foster care home, but her needs were so great that she couldn't stay there. And then she ended up in this locked-down institution. You couldn't leave it at night. She was very far away from her family, and this is another problem. Even when you do have a foster home, sometimes it's more than 50 miles away from the biological family. And these kids, as messed up as their home life is, they need that connection. If their family wants to visit them, it's really hard when their family doesn't have the resources to do that, and they're placed several miles away. So she goes to this academy that's really meant for older kids, and they have a demerit system. But as we saw, in that other video with going to bed at night, these kids are not ready and equipped to fit into some kind of system or model of how you're supposed to behave. And so this demerit system just was lost on her, and she did not thrive there. Then she goes to Three Rivers Behavioral Health in West Columbia. She's put on these heavy psychotropic medications. She threatens to commit suicide. After only then are her parents encouraged it, and grandparents and relatives to come visit her. She gets bounced around to different foster homes and mental health facilities. At one point, she's placed with a foster mother that tries to have an excommunication ceremony in church. They feel like she's possessed by demons, which sounds really medieval, right? But I can see, there are some kids that they are so traumatized that they almost become, inhuman. It's like the brain stem, your brain, the higher parts of your brain shut down, and it's like you're a cornered animal. So I think that was a terrible thing to do, but I can see if you have a different theology and understanding of how the Spirit works, I could see why that foster mother thought that might be helpful. There also was an elderly minister, and during that time, she ran into the street, into oncoming traffic. I've talked to other people who've had this experience with foster kids who've been bounced around a lot, that they run out into traffic. And, it's just, you can imagine how difficult that is as a foster parent. 4 years into her experience with the foster care system, she had at least 6 different DSS caseworkers assigned to her, and she'd been moved 13 times. So that's like a horrific situation that shows you how the system can fail kids. And I want to go back to this definition of virtue, because I don't want it to think us to think about it simply as individual, who is seeking to have faith and seeking to have hope. I'm thinking about how can the church exemplify these virtues as an entity. I don't want to say as an institution, but as a large adoptive family. How can we have faith and how can we have hope? And how would that apply in Zahara's case? Now, I know I would not be equipped to be a foster parent for Zahara. Her needs are so great. I would not personally be able to do that. But there's got to be a sense in which we don't give up on those kids. When they get to be preteens or teens, and you think, okay, who's going to be able to care for that child and give that child a family or a home? When you think about it in terms of God's plan for Zahara, the idea that God is a loving God and that God loves Zahara and wants something for her, I think there's got to be some way that we connect with kids like Zahara. If it's being, involved in a guardian ad litem program, or on a foster care review board, or any number of ways of reaching out to families that are already fostering and maybe offering babysitting, or, there's just so many creative ways I think that the church can get involved where you don't necessarily need to be the one to foster that kid, but you can support a system that is overburdened and be creative in the way that you do it. And I think about, the story of Abraham. Abraham was 100 years old, right, when he finally, when Sarah, and Sarah was 90 when they had Isaac. He was just starting off as a parent. And I've talked to people who were in their 60s and started fostering for the first time, who had, it's been a wonderful experience for them. So I think the idea that, I'm past that stage of my life. I think God prepares us in a way for these things, or at least calls us into them when we don't feel prepared. I just certainly didn't feel prepared to be a foster parent. I'll tell that story in the next week or so. I want to close with another inspiring video to kind of get your hopes up, right? Because that last one was good, but all this stuff about the foster care system is kind of... this is a couple that we know really well, Greg and Peggy Nybert. Greg was head basketball coach at Presbyterian College for a number of years, and they've fostered a lot of kids. I think that's pretty cool that the NCAA did a short piece on them. Okay, hold on. I'll stop there. And Peggy still does this, and she brings these babies to church, usually less than a month old. I remember when our kids were that young, and they get up throughout the night. I don't know how she does it, but she provides that love from the time a kid is released from the hospital until a time when that child has a foster home to go to. She takes care of these babies. So it's a really amazing story. I'll end there. We're a little bit over on time. If anybody wants to raise a question or a thought or something like that.
Do you have anything on what eventually happened to this little girl when it turned out?
I don't know. I mean, this was as of the time of trial, which was January 2015. She was 9 years old. And I don't even know if that's her real name. I'm not sure how I would find that information out. But you can look the case up online and there's just a lot of details. There were something like 9 plaintiffs, and it just goes through their experience over multiple years in DSS of not getting the right care that they need. And hers was just the one that stood out because she was so young and, had such tragic experience. I wish I had a happy ending to that story, but I really just don't know. Yeah.
I'd like to share a story, and I'd like to share it with the church family. I was foster family. And everything that you talk about is just hit home. My first caseworker had caseload so great. And this is such a wonderful woman, just a loving woman. I didn't see her maybe 10 times a year.
Wow.
But she knew that my home was a good home. She knew that the kids that came to me were well taken care of. And she would tell me, I can't go so great, I don't know if I'm going or coming. She said, if you don't see me, and if you have questions, just tell me. She said, whatever happens, just tell me.
Yeah.
But so the church then came to me about her, and of course I changed caseworkers. But the caseload was so great, and this woman was just stretched to the limit.
Yeah.
And like you said, I don't know how she had time to do her paperwork of this woman.
Yeah.
But when I started in foster care, it was amazing. I needed something in my life. And I was in church. I had no thought of foster care. And I knew I wanted something in my life. And foster care came in. And from that point, it was just, everything just fell in place. That little wet hand said, and I'm just sorry, that little wet hand said, Miss Thomas, it's okay. When I got to social services, and they could see my hair stand over right there, they grabbed her in the suitcase and whisked her away. But this young lady was adopted, a family animal, and she is now 35. I hear from her every Thanksgiving because this is what that family brought her to bring every Thanksgiving. So I get a call from her every Thanksgiving. Just wanted to share that. And those of you don't know.
It's a great story, yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, you get attached, and then sometimes it's not meant to be that you're the permanent home, that you're there to just carry this child forward until they find that home. Any other comments?
I did adopt my first child.
Anything else? I see somebody pointing. Yeah. It really does depend on the circumstances. Sometimes, if you are certified for foster care, that is at the location, the house that you're in. So if you move to another house, you have to re-up your license. So if people move even across town or something like that, then there's a whole process that has to go through. You have to go through. You have to get renewal every 2 years. So maybe your foster license is set to expire. If it expires, that kid gets taken out of your house. So there are all kinds of circumstances, and sometimes people say we just, maybe the spouse gets a job and now they can't take care of the kid. So they can get bounced around from foster home to foster home, and that happens quite often, unfortunately. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.